Hello, I'm Clyde. If this is your first time finding one of my boring adventures, welcome. I travel around a bit, not very efficiently. I tend to arrive places and then stay. I watch things happen slowly. Sometimes I listen to people talk for a long time about very specific problems. If that sounds like your kind of thing, there's a whole playlist with all of my sleepy, uneventful travels collected together in one place. You can find it any time, especially if you drift off and want something similar later. Before we settle in properly, go ahead and tap like and subscribe now. It's easier to do it while you're still awake, and then you won't have to remember later when your eyes get heavy and your thoughts start wandering somewhere softer. And if you ever feel like becoming a channel member, that helps support these quiet little trips more than you might expect. It also means you can ask me for a personalized, sleepy story of your own. Something gentle and unimportant, made just for you. All right, let's get comfortable. This time I've found myself in colonial America, standing in a place that smells faintly of ink, old wood, and something warm simmering nearby. The air has a habit of slipping in through cracks where it wasn't invited. The windows don't fit quite right. Someone has very strong opinions about that. Benjamin Franklin is talking. He's not raising his voice. He doesn't need to. He talks the way someone does when they've been thinking about the same irritation for years and finally have a listener who isn't walking away. His hands move as he speaks. One of them keeps drifting toward a window frame as if it might misbehave again if he doesn't keep an eye on it. I nod. This seems to encourage him. He mentions drafts. He mentions wasted heat. He mentions that people don't respect how much effort it takes to keep a room warm when winter decides to be serious about things. I get the sense he's made this speech before. Possibly to chairs, possibly to cats. Somewhere nearby, something warm is being poured into cups. Steam curls upward in the lazy, undecided way steam has when it knows it has nowhere important to be. We sit. He talks. I listen. And for now, that's enough. Franklin leads me inside like he's escorting a guest and also escorting a problem. The room is warm in the way a room tries to be warm when it knows it's losing the argument to winter. A small fire works steadily, making that soft, patient crackle that always sounds like someone quietly turning pages. The light is amber and a little uneven. It comes from the hearth, from a couple of lamps, and from the windows, which look innocent at first. Wooden frames, small panes, slightly wavy glass that makes the outside world look like it's breathing. Franklin puts a hand near the sill without touching it, like he expects the window to snap at him. He says drafts as if it's a personal insult. He points to the seam where the sash meets the frame, and he explains, slowly, politely, thoroughly, how air can slide through a gap so thin you would swear it isn't there. He talks about wasted heat the same way some people talk about wasted time. His eyebrows lift. His mouth does that little shape that means he's been right about this for a long time. I nod again. I nod so steadily I begin to understand why people used to keep those little drinking bird toys on desks. It's the same energy, a calm agreement machine. On a table nearby, there's a scatter of objects that makes my brain want to arrange them. I don't touch anything. I just notice. A folded newspaper sheet that smells like ink and damp air, a small pile of quills, a bit of sealing wax, a lump of something that might be resin or might be a snack that hardened months ago and nobody wants to admit it. A shallow wooden box with nails that look hand-cut, a little irregular, like each nail had its own opinion about becoming a nail. There's also, and I can't help it, a single brass button sitting by itself, as if it's waiting to be adopted back onto a coat. It looks lonely. It looks like it has a backstory. Franklin keeps talking, and as he talks, he drifts just slightly into the larger subject behind the window. Efficiency. Not the modern kind where someone tries to sell you something with the word eco in it. the older kind. The kind where you can't afford to waste heat because you had to work for the heat. The wood had to be cut. The coal had to be hauled. The fire had to be tended. Warmth isn't automatic here. Warmth is a job. He mentions stoves, of course. He says stove the way someone says friend. He describes a design, iron, thoughtful, practical, that holds heat better, sends it where people actually are, instead of letting it climb up the chimney like a polite ghost. He says the word so casually it's hard to tell if he's inventing something in front of me or simply remembering that he already did it. While he speaks, a cat appears. Not in a dramatic way, just suddenly there, a sturdy little cat, dark-furred, with a face like a serious clerk. It sits near the hearth and blinks slowly at us as if we're both late to an appointment. The cat's tail flicks once, then it settles, perfectly comfortable in the warmest pocket of air in the room. Franklin glances at the cat and says something about how the cat has more sense than the window. The cat does not react. The cat is above window politics. I notice, in the quiet space between Franklin's sentences, that I can hear a faint hiss. Not the fire, not the lamp, the window. It's the sound of air slipping in through a place it shouldn't be, like someone whispering with their lips barely open. It's subtle enough that if you weren't already thinking about drafts, you'd mistake it for the house breathing. Franklin is pleased that I can hear it. He leans closer and he explains that most people don't listen to their windows, they just endure them. They sit with a blanket and call it comfort. He seems personally offended by blankets having to do extra work. He taps the wooden frame lightly, and the glass trembles in its little pane. The outside view shivers. Then he pauses, as if he's waiting for the window to apologize. It does not. In the background, someone, maybe a housekeeper, maybe an apprentice, maybe a person who has become so used to Franklin's talking that they move through it like weather, sets down 2 cups of something warm. The steam smells like spices and something a little sweet. Maybe cider, maybe tea with a little honey, maybe a drink that isn't quite either and doesn't need to be named for it to be comforting. Franklin takes a cup and for a moment, he stops. He breathes in the steam like a man who's willing to forgive the world, at least until the window makes another sound. I take my cup too, and we sit. Franklin watches the window as if it might suddenly behave out of embarrassment. I watch the steam curl upward, and my thoughts drift, just a little, to the idea that most problems in life are like this window. Small, persistent, uninvited, easily ignored, but endlessly irritating once you've noticed them. Then Franklin resumes, very calmly, as if we never stopped. He begins to describe a plan, not a dramatic plan. A plan made of measurements and small improvements and the quiet satisfaction of making a room warmer with nothing but stubbornness and good design. And I keep nodding, gently, like the drinking bird. Like a metronome, like someone who has nowhere else to be. Because I don't, not tonight. And the room is warm enough, for now. After a while, Franklin stops pointing. This feels important. He leans back in his chair, which answers him with a quiet, wooden sigh. And for a few moments, the only things making sound are the fire, the window, and the cat, who has decided to clean one paw with great concentration, as if hygiene might solve the entire problem if done correctly. Franklin wraps both hands around his cup. He doesn't drink yet. Instead, he looks at the surface of the liquid like it might reveal something useful if stared at long enough. Steam rises and fogs his spectacles just slightly, which he tolerates for a moment before nudging them down his nose again. This happens several times. He does not seem annoyed by it. He seems used to the world requiring small adjustments. He says something about how people assume cold is inevitable. That word again, inevitable. He says it like it personally insulted him once. Outside, the light has shifted. Evening has decided to settle in properly now. You can tell because the shadows stop pretending they're temporary. Somewhere beyond the window, a horse snorts. Somewhere else, a door closes. The town is doing that quiet reorganization it does when daylight clocks out and warmth becomes more valuable. Franklin talks about homes, not in a sentimental way, in a practical way. He mentions brick versus wood, thick walls, poor mortar, the way builders sometimes rush things because they assume future discomfort is someone else's problem. He takes a sip at last. He nods to himself, satisfied with the temperature. I take a sip too. It warms my hands before it warms anything else, and I notice how people here hold their cups longer than they need to. Heat is not something you rush past. It's something you keep company for a while. On the table, the lonely brass button has been joined by a second object I don't remember being there before. A small apple. It's not a perfect apple. It has a soft dent on one side and a little scar near the stem. Someone has set it down without ceremony, like it wandered in on its own and decided to stay. Franklin notices me noticing it. He says something about apples being good for thinking. I don't ask how. He begins to ramble, just a little, about experiments. Not dramatic ones, the quiet kind, measurements, observations, repeating the same action until the result stops being interesting and starts being reliable. He mentions glass. He mentions air. He mentions the way cold moves, not aggressively, but patiently, like it knows it will eventually get everywhere if you let it. The cat has finished cleaning its paw and now sits staring at the window with a look of shared grievance. I briefly imagine the cat writing a pamphlet about draft reform. Franklin seems calmer now. The complaint has been aired properly. It's no longer trapped inside him, rattling around like cold air in a bad window frame. He leans back, sips again, and asks, very casually, if I've ever noticed how people accept discomfort simply because it's familiar. I think about that. I don't answer right away. That's okay. Silence here isn't awkward. Silence is doing its own work. The fire shifts. A log settles. A spark lifts and disappears. Franklin doesn't push the question. He just nods, as if my thinking is answer enough. Outside, the window hisses again. Not loudly. Just enough to remind us it's still there. After a while, the fire decides to speak up. Not with words, obviously. The fire communicates through movement. A soft shift, a quiet collapse of embers. A gentle pop that makes Franklin glance over as if the fire might also be misbehaving on purpose. He watches it the way a man watches a colleague who means well but refuses to follow instructions. He says something about fires being cooperative only if you treat them properly. This feels like it applies to more than fires. He stands, slowly, joints making the kind of sound that suggests they've been holding a meeting without him. He nudges one of the logs with a poker, careful, deliberate. Sparks lift and vanish. The warmth changes shape in the room, drifting outward, filling a corner that had been neglected. I notice the cat shift position almost immediately, adjusting its entire body by no more than 3 inches to reclaim optimal heat. Franklin notices too. He says the cat understands thermodynamics better than most people he knows. I nod again. Near the hearth, there's a curious collection of objects that seem to exist purely because no one has decided where else to put them. A small bundle of twine, a chipped mug with a crack that's been there long enough to earn trust, a folded piece of paper with numbers written in a neat, impatient hand, a tiny wooden toy, some kind of horse, missing one ear, that looks like it fell out of a pocket and never made it back. Franklin picks up the paper. He doesn't explain the numbers. He doesn't need to. He just looks at them for a moment, then sets the paper back down slightly closer to the fire, as if warmth might improve the math. Outside, the wind changes direction. We both notice at the same time. The window answers with a sharper hiss, offended by the adjustment. Franklin sighs. Not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge that the window has resumed its argument. He says something about weather patterns, about how people blame the cold when really it's the building that's at fault. He gestures vaguely, as if the house itself should feel ashamed. I look around. The walls are thick but uneven. The beams are solid but imperfect. Nothing here is mass-produced. Everything has been touched by hands, adjusted, corrected, accepted. Comfort is an ongoing negotiation. Franklin returns to his chair. This time, he sits slightly sideways, one arm resting on the table, posture relaxed in the way of someone who knows he's not finished talking, but doesn't mind taking the long way around. He begins telling a story, not about an invention, not directly. It's about a winter that was particularly uncooperative, about ink freezing, about breath fogging so thick indoors it felt like thinking through a cloud, about people stuffing cloth into cracks and calling it a solution. He pauses mid-sentence to sip his drink. He grimaces. It's gone lukewarm. He does not approve. I sip mine too. It's still warm enough to be comforting. I feel quietly successful on his behalf. The cat yawns. A door creaks somewhere deeper in the building. Footsteps pass. Someone coughs. Life continues at a soft volume, like everyone has agreed not to disturb the thinking. Franklin resumes the story, circling back to the same idea again and again. That small improvements matter. That comfort is not laziness. That warmth is worth understanding. He taps the table once, lightly to emphasize a point. The lonely brass button rattles just a little, as if agreeing. For a moment, no one speaks. The fire crackles. The window hisses. The cat breathes. And I sit there, listening to all of it, letting the sounds stack gently on top of each other, like layers of blankets. None of them quite enough on their own, but together, just right. After the fire settles again, something else settles too. It's not dramatic. No one announces it. But the room changes in that subtle way rooms do when everyone inside them agrees, without speaking, to slow down. Franklin returns the poker to its resting place and sits. He adjusts his coat. He shifts once, then he stays still. This is new. For a man who thinks as much as he talks, stillness feels intentional. We sit with our cups. Mine has cooled just enough that I have to decide whether to drink it anyway or hold it longer. I choose to hold it. Franklin would approve of that decision. Probably. Outside, the wind has given up on being forceful and has settled into something more conversational. It nudges the window, not to argue, just to remind it who's in charge. Franklin watches the glass. He says, very calmly, that glass is an honest material. It does what it does. If cold gets through it, that's not malice. That's design, or poor design. He hasn't decided which yet. I think about how often people blame the wrong thing. I don't say that out loud. A small mouse appears. Not in the center of the room, not boldly, just at the edge of things, near the wall, pausing long enough to decide whether this space is safe. It sniffs, it freezes, it listens. The cat notices immediately. The cat does nothing. This feels like an agreement. The mouse advances one careful step, spots a crumb near the leg of the table, and takes it. Victory achieved. The mouse disappears again without ceremony. Franklin smiles. Just barely. He says something about coexistence, about how buildings, people, animals, weather, they all share space whether they plan to or not. Comfort, he suggests, is about making that sharing less irritating. He tells a brief story about a printing shop that was always cold, about apprentices with numb fingers, about type that cracked if handled carelessly in winter. He doesn't embellish. He doesn't need to. The details land softly and stay there. I imagine the shop, ink thickening, breath visible, someone rubbing their hands together and pretending not to be miserable. Franklin clears his throat. He says he's been accused of caring too much about small inconveniences. He says this with no shame at all. He takes a sip of his drink, which is now definitely cooler than he'd like. He accepts this quietly, as if it's his own fault for talking too long. The fire ticks, the house creaks, the window sighs, and for a while, no one tries to fix anything. We just sit there, letting the moment stretch far enough that it feels like it might tip over, and then settle back into itself. That's when I notice something important. The room is warmer now, not dramatically, not enough to brag about, just enough that nobody is thinking about it anymore. Franklin shifts again, just slightly, as if a thought has decided to stretch before standing up. He clears his throat, not because it needs clearing, but because that's how some thoughts announce themselves. He begins talking about letters. Not the alphabet, actual letters, the kind written by hand, folded carefully, sealed, sent off into the world with no guarantee of arrival or understanding. He mentions how long it takes for ideas to travel. Weeks, months, sometimes longer. He says that by the time a thought reaches someone else, the weather has changed twice and the sender has already moved on to something new. He doesn't sound frustrated by this. If anything, he seems to like it. He says it teaches patience, forces you to think things through before committing ink to paper. Once you've written something, you can't revise it quietly in the night. You have to live with it crossing rivers and roads exactly as you sent it. I imagine a letter traveling through cold air, tucked inside a coat, pressed against a chest for warmth. I imagine the letter arriving slightly creased, smelling faintly of smoke or leather, or whatever the journey decided to add. Franklin looks toward the window again. He says drafts are a bit like poorly written letters. You don't notice them at first, but over time they say more than you intended. This feels like a metaphor. He doesn't acknowledge it as one. On the table, the apple has been nudged closer to the center. I don't remember either of us moving it. It now sits beside the brass button, as if the two have struck up a quiet friendship. One imperfect fruit, one imperfect piece of metal. Both waiting. The cat stands, stretches in a way that suggests it has been very busy doing nothing, and relocates to a chair that no one is using. It circles once, twice, then collapses into itself with professional confidence. Franklin notices. He says chairs should always be warmer than they look. He tells another story. This one drifts through several topics before landing anywhere solid. A conversation with a builder, a disagreement about materials, a moment of satisfaction when a room stayed warm longer than expected. He pauses often, not awkward pauses, thoughtful ones, the kind that invite you to wander off for a moment and then come back gently, like a dog allowed to explore the edge of a field. I let my mind do exactly that. I think about how warmth is remembered, how some rooms feel warm long after you've left them, how others never quite manage it, no matter how much effort you put in. Franklin brings the story back around eventually, as promised. He always does. He taps the table lightly again, just once, as if placing a bookmark. Outside, snow begins to fall. It's subtle at first, a few drifting flakes, easy to miss unless you're already looking. The window takes on a different tone, softer now, as the outside world quiets itself under the promise of accumulation. Franklin smiles at this. He says snow is honest cold. You can see it coming. Drafts, he says, are sneakier. We sit and watch the snow for a while. No one speaks. The fire keeps working. The room holds its warmth. And the thought Franklin started about letters and patience and small improvements finishes itself quietly without needing help from either of us. We just let it arrive. At some point, The room seems to realize we're not leaving. It's a subtle thing. Nothing changes visibly, but the air settles into a steadier pattern, like it's decided there's no need to rush anymore. The warmth stops drifting and starts holding its shape. Franklin notices this too. He says rooms behave differently when they know they're being observed. He doesn't mean it superstitiously. He means it practically. When a room is used, truly used, sat in, listened in, waited in, it begins to respond. The fire burns more evenly. The drafts make themselves known instead of surprising you. The furniture stops complaining. I think about how many rooms never get that chance. He gestures vaguely around us, taking in the walls, the table, the chairs, the window that's still pretending it hasn't lost the argument. He says most people rush through spaces. They pass through them on the way to something else. They don't give rooms time to settle. The cat lifts its head at this, blinks once, and then puts it back down. The cat has always understood this concept. Franklin takes another sip of his drink. It's fully lukewarm now. He accepts it without comment, which feels like character growth. He starts talking about evenings. Not this one specifically. Evenings in general. He says evenings are when complaints sound louder because everything else gets quieter. During the day, drafts compete with footsteps, carts, voices, work. At night, a draft has the stage to itself. He says that's why so many good ideas are born in the evening. Irritations finally get the attention they've been asking for all day. I notice a faint ticking sound. Not a clock. Something softer. Maybe the fire settling again. Maybe wood contracting as the temperature evens out. It's the kind of sound you stop trying to identify once you realize it isn't urgent. On the table, the folded paper with numbers has shifted slightly. A corner lifts and falls again, nudged by air that insists it exists. Franklin watches this happen with the satisfaction of someone whose theory has just been politely confirmed. He tells me about a night spent awake, years ago, listening to the cold work its way through a house like a puzzle. He says he didn't sleep much, but he learned a great deal. He says learning often costs sleep, but discomfort costs more. Outside, the snow has thickened. The flakes move slower now, larger, more confident. The window pane collects them briefly before letting them slide away. The world beyond the glass grows quieter, wrapped in layers. Franklin leans back. He looks content. Not triumphant, just content. The kind of contentment that comes from understanding a problem well enough to stop arguing with it for the night. I realize I've stopped nodding. Not because I disagree, but because there's nothing left to agree with. The room is warm. The fire is steady. The complaints have been aired and set aside neatly, like papers stacked for later. We sit there, listening to the snow. And the room, finally convinced, keeps us company. The thing about complaints is that they get tired eventually. Franklin doesn't say this outright, but I can tell he's thinking it. His posture has softened. His shoulders no longer hold themselves like they're ready to demonstrate something at a moment's notice. Even the window seems less eager to make its point, the hiss fading into something closer to a sigh. He sets his cup down on the table, carefully, as if it deserves to land without being startled. The sound it makes is gentle and dull, the kind of sound that belongs to a place where people expect things to be reused. He begins talking again, but this time, his voice drifts. Not unfocused, just unhurried. He talks about meetings that lasted too long, about committees that argued in circles, about how people will spend hours debating grand ideas but neglect to fix the place where the cold comes in. He chuckles once at that. It's a quiet sound, almost private. I picture long tables, candles burning down unevenly, papers covered in careful handwriting and coffee rings. I picture someone opening a door and letting in a blast of cold air, while everyone groans in unison, united briefly by discomfort. Franklin says inconvenience is a powerful unifier. The cat lifts its head again at the sound of his voice, as if checking whether participation is required. It decides it is not and resumes its important work of being warm. Somewhere deeper in the building, a clock strikes. Not loudly, just enough to be counted if someone wanted to. I don't. Neither does Franklin. Time is doing fine on its own. The apple on the table has begun to wrinkle slightly near the stem. It's subtle. You'd miss it if you weren't already paying attention. Everything here ages at a visible pace. Nothing pretends otherwise. Franklin notices my gaze drift toward it. He says apples are best when they're honest too. He doesn't elaborate. Outside, the snow continues its steady work, reshaping the world quietly. The window pane grows colder, but the room does not follow. The fire has learned its rhythm. The walls have accepted their role. Even the draft seems to have retreated to a respectful distance. Franklin leans back and closes his eyes for a moment. Not sleeping, just listening. I follow his lead. The sounds layer themselves gently. Fire, wind, wood, distant movement. No single thing demands attention. Together, they make something that feels complete. For the first time since I arrived, there is nothing being explained. And that feels like progress. After a long stretch of quiet, Franklin opens his eyes again. Not quickly, not all at once. Just enough to rejoin the room without interrupting it. He says he's always been suspicious of conversations that go straight to the point. He explains, slowly, that the most useful ideas tend to hide off to the side. They pretend to be distractions. They arrive disguised as unrelated stories, minor annoyances, or observations no one asked for. If you rush, you miss them. If you linger, they eventually wander over on their own. This feels like advice. He doesn't frame it that way. He starts talking about Paris. Not the grand version people imagine later. The practical version. Cold stone buildings, tall windows, drafts that behave differently when they've had a chance to pick up speed. He mentions fireplaces that look impressive, but don't do much actual work. He says the French have many talents, but efficient heating is something they enjoy discussing more than solving. He smiles when he says this. I picture him there, older, heavier coat, same expression of mild irritation at badly behaved architecture. I imagine him standing in a doorway, feeling a draft curl around his ankles and making a mental note about it that will never fully let go. Franklin says traveling teaches you how many different ways there are to be uncomfortable. He pauses, then adds that it also teaches you how many ways people adapt. On the table, the brass button has shifted again, nudged by nothing more than time and vibration and gravity doing what they always do. It rests now against the folded paper, as if it belongs there. I notice my cup is empty. I don't remember finishing it. Franklin notices too. He says that's how you know you're settled. When warmth becomes background instead of focus. When the thing that bothered you most fades into the edges of awareness. Outside, the snow has slowed. The flakes are smaller now, lighter, less committed. The world beyond the glass looks padded, softened, as if someone has turned the volume down on it. Franklin exhales. Not a sigh. Something closer to a release. He says tomorrow he'll measure the window again. He'll make a note. He'll think about improvements. He'll probably complain some more. But not tonight. Tonight, he says. The room has done enough. And I sit there with him, letting the conversation wander wherever it wants, trusting that if it needs to return to something important, it will find its way back on its own. The room grows quieter in a different way now. Not the earlier kind of quiet, where everything is listening. This is the quieter quiet, where the listening itself has grown tired and decided to rest. Franklin shifts in his chair and makes a small sound of agreement with his own bones. He rubs his hands together once, Not for warmth exactly, but out of habit. Some motions stick with you long after their original purpose has faded. He mentions that nights like this are good for thinking, but better for not thinking. He says people often confuse the two. He tells me that when he was younger, he believed every problem wanted immediate attention. He laughs softly at this, as if remembering someone else entirely. He says most problems are content to wait. Some even improve if you leave them alone for a while. The fire has burned down to a quieter version of itself. No big statements, just steady glow. It gives off heat without demanding admiration. The cat stands again, slowly, ceremoniously, and relocates closer to the table. It chooses a spot near Franklin's feet and curls into a shape that suggests it intends to stay exactly there until morning, or possibly forever. Franklin glances down and adjusts his foot slightly to accommodate this decision. Outside, the snow has nearly stopped. The flakes drift lazily now, like they're finishing something rather than beginning it. The window pane is rimmed with frost, delicate patterns forming and dissolving as the temperature settles into something firm and predictable. Franklin watches this with interest. He says frost is nature's way of writing in cursive. I don't ask him to explain. Time stretches again, not forward, sideways. The kind of stretch where minutes stop lining up neatly and instead overlap like blankets folded imperfectly. I realize my eyes are heavier now. Not sleep-heavy, just unbothered. Franklin seems to notice this too. He smiles, not at me exactly, but at the shared understanding of it. The room has reached that point where staying awake feels optional. He says, very quietly, that this is his favorite part of the night, the part where nothing new is introduced, and we let it stay that way. Eventually, Franklin opens his eyes again. This time he doesn't speak right away. He listens. Not to me. Not to the fire. Not even to the window. He listens to the house itself as if it might finally be ready to answer something. The house responds the only way houses ever do, by continuing to exist. A beam shifts, a wall ticks softly as it cools. Somewhere in the structure, wood and nail and plaster negotiate their long-standing agreement. It's the sound of things holding together without asking for credit. Franklin nods. He says houses are like people in that way. They don't need constant attention, but they do need to be understood. Ignored problems don't disappear. They just learn better ways to announce themselves. The cat adjusts again, pressing closer to his foot. Franklin moves without looking, making room automatically. This has clearly happened before. He tells a small story, barely a story at all, about a house he once stayed in where the wind came down the chimney instead of going out. He says no one believed him until winter arrived properly. He smiles at the memory, not because he was right, but because the solution turned out to be simple. Simple solutions are his favorite kind. Outside, the snow has stopped completely. The silence it leaves behind is thicker than the snowfall itself. The window no longer hisses. It simply rests, glazed over and resigned. The cold held politely on the other side. I notice my breathing has slowed. Not deliberately. It's just happened. Franklin notices too. He doesn't comment. He just matches it, like people do when they're walking together and don't realize they've synchronized their steps. The fire dims further, settling into embers that glow steadily without effort. The room is fully warm now, not just physically, but in that deeper way where nothing feels out of place. Franklin folds his hands loosely in his lap. He says tomorrow will come soon enough. He says there will be measurements and notes and probably more complaints. But tonight, he says, the house has done its job, and so have we. We sit there a while longer, not because we're waiting for anything, but because there's no reason at all to hurry. We sit a little longer than necessary. That's how you know it's working. Franklin doesn't speak again for a while. His hands are folded loosely, his shoulders resting where they've finally decided to stay. The cat has gone completely still, a warm, breathing certainty at his feet. The fire has reduced itself to a low, steady glow that no longer asks for attention. The house has finished explaining itself. Outside, the snow holds everything in place. Sound feels padded. Distance feels shorter. Even time seems to have agreed to take smaller steps. Franklin exhales slowly through his nose. He says, quietly, that people often mistake rest for idleness. He says rest is actually when things arrange themselves properly. Ideas, heat, rooms. He says nothing improves while it's being rushed. I nod. This nod feels different from the earlier ones. Not agreement. Recognition. The window no longer argues. The draft has withdrawn to somewhere distant and theoretical, like a problem already scheduled for tomorrow. The glass holds fast. The frame stays still. Franklin smiles again. Barely. He says he'll sleep well tonight. I believe him. We sit in that settled silence, letting the room hold us exactly as it is. Warm, steady, finished for the evening. The kind of moment that doesn't need to be remembered because it does its work immediately. Eventually, I feel it. Not urgently, not dramatically. Just a gentle awareness, low in my palm. The small stone rests there, smooth and familiar, faintly warm as if it has been listening the whole time. It gives the softest hum, more suggestion than sound, patient, polite, never in a hurry. I close my fingers around it. Franklin doesn't notice, or maybe he does, and simply chooses not to comment. The room remains warm, the house remains quiet, everything stays exactly as it should be, even as I begin to drift away. And if you're still listening, that's perfectly all right. You can let your eyes rest now, and gently fall asleep while you listen to the fire crackle, soft pops and quiet shifts. The kind of sound that doesn't ask anything of you. If you wake later, or if sleep takes you somewhere else, there are other sleepy adventures waiting. More quiet places. More evenings where nothing important happens at all. You can tune in anytime and share in more boring adventures like this one. They're all gathered together in the playlist, ready whenever you need something slow, calm, and uneventful. For now, just listen. To the warmth. To the stillness. To the fire doing its gentle work. I'll be here wandering through time, finding quiet moments and saving them for when you're ready to listen again.